Welcome to T-Town Buffet, presented by WAKT 106.1 FM on your radio dial. We will serve up a full plate of information and conversation. My name is Colman McCord, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Howard McCord. Mr. McCord is a retired professor of English from Bowling Green State University and at present time a writer of poems, prose, and opinion. Mr. McCord has recently sold the motion picture rights to his short novel, The Man Who Walked to the Moon, to a production company in France that is in the pre-production stage right now. Mr. McCord will provide insight into the struggles of society in the 1960s and how it relates to the struggles of today. I'm going to go into full disclosure mode and let the audience know that Howard McCord is my father. We went through the 60s together, but he remembers more than I do. Welcome, sir, and
thank you, Coleman. I'm happy to be here. I've lived a long time, and I remember a lot, and I'm not going to be able to encapsulate it all in one 30-minute session, but I did want to very quickly characterize the America I knew from early days up till now, with some real pauses to consider the elements in the 60s and perhaps the 70s. I was born in 1932, so I'm a Depression baby. Luckily, my family didn't really suffer too much. Both my father and my both grandfathers had good jobs and stayed at them the whole time. But I saw a lot of the misery. I saw freight trains with hundreds of hobos riding on top, searching for someplace better. And as I grew up through those years, I saw a small increase in, might say, civilization, it seemed to me, with things like the CCC putting a lot of unemployed people to work and things being built. And I was, coming out when I was in the 1940, I would be 8, so I would be in the 2nd grade, and of course then the world exploded with the Second World War. And I was fascinated by it, probably frightened by it, and I listened to the news every day. I read the newspapers. I always loved to read. My mother said I taught myself to read from cereal boxes, and so I went through the 1940s, particularly the war years, just simply becoming more and more aware of the crazy earth that we inhabit and the people on it and the kind of wild and savage things that could happen. And here I'm just a little boy, but those are the things I knew. And luckily, I didn't have to experience them like so many millions did. Then I started high school. That would be in 1946, and no, be 47. That would be junior high, and this time, my father had gone into the service. Was in the Philippines, came back, and was the fire chief of a William Beaumont Army Hospital Annex. And that was where they put the German rocket scientists that they brought from Peenemünde. We were the only American family on the base. It had been shut down as a hospital, but the German scientists and their families were living there. So I would go swimming with German scientists and their kids. And also we had V-2 rockets parked in our backyard. And again, there was this kind of really strange life going on around me that I got to witness, but I didn't have anything to do with it. School was good. I loved to read. I had wonderful teachers, and I ended up writing my first poetry in 1950 as a senior. And then, of course, the Korean War erupted, and that changed my life quite radically. I went down in December 1950 to join the Navy, and they called me up in March of 51, and I went off to boot camp, and then several schools, and Naval Air Station, San Diego, and finally put on board the Essex, an aircraft carrier, a wonderful old ship, and off to the waters of the far Western Pacific, Japan, Korea. We sailed up within 70 miles of Vladivostok, I was told, and certainly the wind was cold enough to come from Siberia. We then sailed down through the South China Sea. I remember seeing the Pacific suddenly go brown as we passed the area where the Yellow River pours out incredible amounts of silt, and I think we were probably 100 miles from the China coast, and the sea was still yellow. When we were down in the Philippines, we had a strange experience, which I didn't come to understand for many, many years later because it was kept secret. We were out at sea, heading over toward Vietnam, and about all I knew about Vietnam at that time was that the French were still there, and at the moment they were surrounded at Dien Bien Phu, and it wasn't likely they were going to get out. And then one morning we got up, I went down to go to breakfast, and there on the flight deck were these huge containers, about 6 of them, with a Marine guard with a Tommy gun beside each one. And we all said, what the hell is this? Must be the atomic bombs. I wonder who we're going to bomb, you know. We're in the peace talks in Korea, and I don't know that we want to get in a war with China. And of course, we were told absolutely nothing. They never told us where we were going, or anything. You just kind of had to wait and see. But years later, 1968, it was finally revealed that somebody in the Pentagon had come up with a plan to drop small tactical nukes on the North Vietnamese army that had surrounded Dien Bien Phu, and with that, kill the army and liberate the French from their essentially their fort, which was now their prison. Of course, somebody got a slide rule out and figured that would kill all the Frenchmen too. And so they, after about 3 days, the bombs disappeared, and we heard nothing. But later on, it was 1968, it was released, and it's available, that story, in a book. Which, and so I felt, you know, even at the time, not knowing really what, but that living in this world at this time, you never know when you're going to be in the presence of some really totally earth-shattering event. Later on, at 9/11, I had 3 of my children in Manhattan that morning, and they certainly never thought anything like that could happen. But things like that do happen. To jump up, I went after the Navy. I drove a bookmobile for a year and had a good time doing it, but I really was wanting to get back to school and learning. So Coleman's mother, my wife Dora, and I went to El Paso, and we both went to University of Texas at El Paso. And I found it, as I still find it, a remarkably good university. And I learned a great deal. I wrote more. I had my first poems published in 1953, before I even went back. And I just became more and more certain that my life was going to be caught up in writing. But at the same time, this world we live in, it was the height of the Cold War, and you always were somehow partially aware that there could suddenly be a huge blast of light and you'd be gone. And so it was strange. After I kept writing and publishing in little magazines, particularly along the West Coast. My first publication was in a magazine called Miscellaneous Man, which was back in 1953, and it was being sold by Lawrence Ferlinghetti at his City Lights bookstore. And then in 1956, after Howl came out, Ginsberg's poem, the San Francisco police raided Ferlinghetti's store and seized copies of Howl, but also of the magazine I was in. And I suppose that sort of validates my acceptance into the Beat generation. That I was there then, though I really wasn't. My poetry was, and I don't think it was my poetry, certainly, that the police thought was obscene. I never knew what they thought was obscene about the magazine. But it was, again, a strange time. Police don't raid bookstores anymore, here anyway, but they raided Ferlinghetti again in 1966 because he published a book by Lenore Candell called The Love Book. And luckily that case didn't last long. It was thrown out as there was no obscenity here. But this was part of the Beat generation, the conflict with the authorities, and it was the time of the McCarthy hearings, of congressional investigations of writers, of the Hollywood 10, of all sorts of suspicions about the loyalty of people who wrote and who dreamed. And it sometimes got really ugly. That the current election reminds me a bit of those days, as well as some other days where there was simply a lot of anger and a lot of fear and a lot of intemperate language, particularly directed at artists, at writers, at people who wrote for magazines that were not quite conventional enough, that sort of thing. And the other thing that was in the air was the wonderful cultural explosion that was happening throughout Europe as Europe recovered from the Second World War. You get the Italian neorealism films, De Sica's Bicycle Thief, which won the Academy Award in 1948, which was very soon after that country had emerged from wreckage. There was then Ingmar Bergman producing and directing these absolutely marvelous films that I still, for me, are the greatest films ever made. There was in Hollywood the film noir, those dark, dirty detective stories with interesting people. Not always on the up and up, but that's the way it should be in a crime-ridden city like Hollywood. And there was a new music, West Coast jazz. Dave Brubeck, Jerry Mulligan, that whole group of wonderful musicians. Brubeck lasted until actually early this year. He died at 90-something. And he was still making incredibly good music that, to me, characterized the emerging artists of the time. In painting, abstract expressionism was beginning to flower in New York and elsewhere. The whole idea of nearly all these arts was that they were breaking down the conventions that had been held for quite a while. I mean, the artists of the 20s had done the same thing, but not nearly so rigorously as I think the post-World War II artistic revolution here in America. And it was not an easy fight because there was so much suspicion of people who were doing new things. All the jokes about modern art, oh, my kid could do that. Well, give your kid a brush and see if he really can. Not likely. I ended the 50s in graduate school at the University of Utah, studying things like Sanskrit, Anglo-Saxon, Indo-European grammar, and a lot of medieval literature. I was on my way to becoming a literary scholar, or a professor, and what have you. And I also kept writing poetry. Then I got my first teaching job at Washington State University in 1960. I moved up there, was enjoying my teaching, and then you might say the revolution of the 60s started to begin. I've always thought that it was Aldous Huxley and the Doors of Perception that really kind of triggered that very strange decade, because he had taken mescaline and reported brilliantly on its dramatic effects on his mind, and the way that it, as he put it, cleansed perception so that things could be seen not as they commonly are, but as something closer perhaps to what they actually are. Cary Grant was an early Hollywood practitioner with LSD. And of course the same thing was going on at Harvard with Tim Leary and his experiments with psychedelic drugs. And he, of course, got quite carried away, left Harvard, became a guru of sorts, I suppose, and spread the word. And so people were turning on, tuning in, and dropping out. And this was, upset a lot of parents, I'm sure. And, probably with some justification. I remember a wonderful poet, I'll just give his first name, Tim, who was a Greek scholar. He was in graduate school at the University of Texas, and had published 2 or 3 very nice little books. And then he just seemed to disappear entirely. And it wasn't until 1975 I was at a party at a friend's in Berkeley, and here is Tim. And I said, "What happened to you, man?" And he said, "Well, I was dropping a lot of acid in those days, and 2 years later I woke up in Athens, Greece." And he was still sort of on a distant track I don't know what's become of him since. I hope he's still around. I hope he's still writing. My wife managed to find maybe 8 of his books at a bookstore down by Dayton, and bought them for me. He was a wonderful poet, and I hope he continues to write and flourish and not drop quite so much acid. But there was that 60s that was the breaking down of conventions again. As in the 50s, there had been the breaking, you might say, of the artistic conventions. These were more personal convictions. People didn't cut their hair. People went barefoot. Remember, you've all seen those signs, no shoes, no shirt, no service. That came strictly out of the 60s. Never existed before. And it was a response of you might say just the ordinary, non-particularly artistic person to what seemed to him or her to be very strange goings on and not really to be trusted. But they broke down a lot of conventions in the 60s, some of which were probably very useful to be broken, but others maybe were not, because the war was generating more and more steam. 1964, Kennedy had put some non-combat advisors in Vietnam. There were 16,000 of them there in 1963. By 1968, LBJ had increased the number to 550,000. I happened to go into that neighborhood in 1965 on my way to India, where I was studying for a summer. I stopped in Bangkok and just happened, went to a hotel, and the lobby was full of Air Force pilots sitting around, having their drinks, relaxing, and they were part of the, was it Ton Sanut Air Base? I've forgotten the name of the base there in Thailand, but it was a place where we based our B-52s, who were trying to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail and other things like that. And it just had not really hit me what was going on. It was like, okay, I remember Poland, Czechoslovakia, and all that from the Second World War. Now this, and of course in those days there was the draft. And as a college teacher, I felt a great deal of pressure, and most of my peers did also, about not being responsible for having a student drafted because he hadn't got a decent grade. And that was what was happening. And so there was
What was the grade average you had to maintain in order to stay out of the war?
I wish I could be sure. I'm going to say C's disappeared and turned into B's. And I don't know that it may have been an individual draft boards, I just don't have a number for that.
Okay.
But it did lead to the inflation of grades in colleges, which has not disappeared yet, even though the draft has been gone for years and years. And I'm kind of two minds. I wish I'd been rigorous enough to just say, you've got to learn this, or you're going to have to get drafted. But, not everybody can that well. C used to be an ordinary grade. It's what an ordinary person would get. It wasn't disgraceful. It was, in Harvard they called it the gentleman's C. You know, that was, you weren't supposed to be there and be a genius. You were just there to learn good manners, meet nice people, and find a rich young girl to marry. And
the world is run by C students.
I know, and you know, it's right there in the middle. But it was, I really hold the draft in the Vietnam War for the elevation in grades that continues right now. I left nearly 20 years ago from teaching, and I hear that now a huge number of people in many classes get A's, and if there was something above an A, they'd probably get that and demand it. And I think it's really bad because it deceives the person as to what he has really learned, what he's really mastered, and if you think about the next doctor you go to, I think medical schools maybe are still a little more rigorous, but the whole idea that somehow the education can get diluted for less than good reasons. It's during all this time, I also, as part of growing up in El Paso, Texas, close to some wonderful mountain ranges, I continued to climb and explore mountain ranges whenever I could. When I was up at Utah, I climbed and explored in the Wasatch. Back home around El Paso, the Oregon Mountains outside of Las Cruces, New Mexico, are probably, to me, the most beautiful mountains in America, and as well as the roughest. The Guadalupes, which now have been turned into a national park, but I got to walk the length of McKittrick Canyon before they forbade it. I did that back in 1950, and the Chiricahua Mountains over in Arizona, which are where there are now American jaguars, at least one of them, and actually there have been three or four sightings up there. It just that's the kind of world that excited me. I had two places to live. One was in an intellectual world of learning old languages and reading weird texts and writing fairly weird texts, and then the wild world of the mountains and the desert. And one thing about wandering off on long walks is you sometimes find yourself, and that was what I kept doing time and time again. Later on, I'd go to Iceland and to walk and travel in the interior, and to go on to northern Sweden to the Kungsleden, which is a wonderful trail, sort of, you might say, the Swedish equivalent of the Appalachian Trail or the Pacific Coast Trail. And I walked it, and then mountain ranges everywhere in the West, in Nevada, in Idaho, in Washington, Oregon. The Wallowas there, again, are one of the most beautiful ranges in America. My son Colman first went up into them when he was 5 years old, and I think I carried him that first time. But then the next year, he beat us all to the top of the Alp where we went in to hike. And that kind of experience has been important to me just all my life. I made a note here. The thing about the wilderness is the way things were. It affords a kind of time travel. You go into the wilderness, civilization disappears. Sometimes you wish it would disappear and just disappear. But it's one of the great attractions of the wilderness is the absence of all this stuff around us. I like a world with very few people, and it always kind of sustains me. I kept writing. My first book was published in '63. I had 4 or 5 more books throughout the '60s, more, usually about, I think I've got something like 36, 38 books out now. I don't keep track. And it's in my later years, it's been a total delight to find that a novel I wrote, and which, it did okay. It sold 2 small editions here in the U.S., pretty much sold them out. But it was picked up by a French publisher, Oliver Gallmeister, and I was in France this fall and talked with Oliver, and it is now sold over 15,000 copies, which is not bad for a very, very weird story. And of course, as Colman mentioned, the movie option has been purchased, and I've got a very interesting movie maker working on it, and I'll hope it won't be too long before I get a chance to see it.
Thank you for stopping in at T-Town Buffet, Mr. McCord. Tune in to T-Town Buffet on 106.1 FM WAKT for information and conversation. This is Colman McCord signing off.